Today's program is Peter Stein, longtime Bay Area filmmaker and film festival director, and he's currently senior programmer for Frameline. Peter's subject today is Hollywood's Double Take, Depicting and Avoiding the Holocaust. So please join me in giving a big welcome to Peter Stein.
Thank you, Barbara. It's very nice to be here and to see you all again. I'm just curious, it's totally fine if you weren't here, but I'm curious how many of you were at the last talk. Okay, many of you are repeat folks. I won't be referring back to that much, but it's at least helpful to know. I think we should just jump right in and show you a clip.
August 1939. Nazi troops mass on the western border of Poland. Europe stands precariously on the brink of World War II. But in Warsaw, despite the threat of imminent invasion, the Polish people forget their troubles at the Bronski Theater.
Jak się topić, to się topić, Sweet Georgie Brown. Daj całusa, poleć w busa, Sweet Georgie Brown. Jak się zciepia, wtedy w niebie, Sweet Georgie Brown. Mój los dobrze znasz, ten co pewnie masz, okej.
So I begin our program today. That, of course, is Mel Brooks and his wife Anne Bancroft in the 1983 remake of what had been Ernst Lubitsch's 1940 film, To Be or Not to Be, set in 1939 Warsaw. And I start with that partly because it's fun, it's funny, and because this is a program that is largely about stories about Nazism, the rise of Nazism, persecution of Jews, and the Holocaust. This is probably the most fun clip we're going to show today. Nice to start out with something upbeat. But also, not to stretch the analogy too far, in a way, Mel Brooks's goofy scene of people tap dancing on the eve of the Holocaust, with the Bronski couple blithely entertaining the masses of Warsaw on the eve of an invasion. It's kind of a good metaphor for our topic today, because we're taking a look at how Hollywood took as its assignment the notion of entertaining in a mass medium large numbers of people across the United States and the world, while still, like the Bronskis, having to tap dance around a very difficult topic, mining the stories of the war, which of course were tremendously fertile ground for stories of conflict and drama and melodrama and heroism and so forth, while also having to figure out how do we deal with one of the core issues of the war, which was the oppression and attempted extermination of Jews. Very, very contradictory and difficult material, and a painful topic. And we're going to take a look today at the way Hollywood had its own set of contradictions and love-hate relationships, sometimes avoidance of that topic, and often choosing to make films that either sugarcoated the experience of Jews, were willfully ignorant of the experience of Jews during the war, trivialized that experience, and at the same time was the source of a tremendous amount of powerful imagery that has become part of our collective understanding and collective narratives of the experiences of Jews during the war. So it's interesting subject matter, and we're going to take a look at a number of films in that trajectory, starting pre-war and moving up to the films of the 2000s. Early Hollywood had a long history already before the rise of Nazism of depicting stories in which Jews were oppressed. Those of you who were here last time knew that many of the films of the silent era dealt with minorities making it up in the world, and we took a look even last time at one of those films, Hungry Hearts, which was the story, and this was practically a subgenre of films in the silent era of Jews fleeing the Cossacks, fleeing the pogroms of Eastern Europe and coming to America. You also had stories in which, even if you didn't have the depiction of Cossacks and direct anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe, you did have stories of Jews being oppressed by poverty, by greedy landlords, by swindlers. There's a whole subgenre of films in which it was a narrative trope to show Jews being the victims of oppression. And yet, when we come to the rise of Nazism, come the 1930s, despite this long history and despite the rise of Hitler in Germany and the known anti-Semitic nature of the ideology in Nazi Germany, Hollywood kept a very, very, very careful distance from addressing those topics. And we got to ask why. What's going on there? Well, one is the self-image of the Hollywood movie makers themselves. Many of the studio heads were, in fact, Jewish. They feared, in a way, being accused of something that was self-serving, of propagandizing or focusing unnecessarily too much on their own Jewish heritage. And so you had families who had successfully assimilated and risen to the height of Hollywood fame and power, the Laemmles, the Warner Brothers, the Selznicks, Louis B. Mayer. Did I mention the Warner Brothers? Yes, the Goldwyns. I knew I was missing somebody. The fact of their successful assimilation meant that many of them saw their Jewishness as something to essentially not pay attention to help them assimilate and melt into the pot. So many of them, in fact, saw their Jewishness as a burden to their success and didn't want to address it in their films at all. Not that they're the makers of films, but ultimately, these studio heads had the yay or nay power to go ahead and make a film or not. So self-image of the Jewish studio heads not to put too much attention on their own Jewish heritage might be one reason why during the 30s we really didn't see much attention paid to the plight of Jews across the seas. There's also the matter of external perception. Like their fellow Jews in the mass media broadcasting areas, like David Sarnoff at RCA and Bill Paley's Columbia Broadcasting System, the Jewish studio heads were creating a mass media that needed to appeal to a very broad public. And this was an era in which marking cultural differences, ethnic differences, this was not seen as necessarily a badge of great interest and remarkable something to celebrate in stories. Oftentimes cultural differences, the trope of the day was to erode those, to have the successful outcome of a film character or any kind of dramatic or literary character be the successful assimilation into the larger American mainstream. So focusing on cultures or groups who might be different, particularly overseas, and depicting those as at the center of a narrative might be seen as something that was too parochial, not of interest to the American people, and certainly not typical of the storylines that the films of the 30s were focusing on. So that might be one other issue. As the drumbeat of war began to get louder as we moved toward the late 30s, there was also the question of the studio heads not wishing to be seen as advocating for American involvement in, at that time, the overseas war. Remember that in 1939, after England and France had already entered the war with Germany, there was a poll taken of Americans. 90% favored removing themselves, that is, favored an isolationist standpoint, still 90%. It wasn't until the attack on Pearl Harbor and the growing concern about the overtaking of democratic countries in Europe that American public opinion began to turn. So early on, even in the mid to late 30s, the studio heads were not particularly eager to have films that might be seen as advocating for American involvement. Now, it wasn't until 1939, this is 6 years after Hitler's rise to power, 3 years after the Nuremberg Laws, a year after Kristallnacht, only in 1939, did a studio film appear whose storyline could be seen as anti-German, and that was the Warner Brothers' Confessions of a Nazi Spy, starring Edward G. Robinson. This was based on an actual event, the FBI's breakup of an actual Nazi spy ring in New York. But there, in that film, the focus was entirely on seeing this Nazi spy ring as foreign spies on American soil, that it was a threat to American democracy, not any kind of reflection on the anti-Jewish ideology happening in Germany at that time. So, but at least you got one film that began to express some real fear, rightly or wrongly, of Nazi power. The fact is also the movie business was heavily dependent on overseas revenue. It's not just now that we have the studios not caring really who wins an Oscar, but just making sure that the Chinese public and the Czech Republic and Southeast Asia and India are all lining up to buy their films. In the 1930s, American studios had very, very strong collaboration with the German film industry and the German film-going public. There was a really interesting book, somewhat controversial last year, called The Collaboration, Hollywood's Pact with Hitler. Maybe some of you even came to the lecture that was given here on this stage by Ben Irwand, who's the author. Anyway, he documents the very, very profitable business relationships that studios had with Germany under Hitler. Ford Motor Company, I'm not a movie maker, obviously Ford Motor Company kept their factories open in Germany, making autos through 1941, for example, and the studios were very willing to comply with some of the censorship laws within Germany that essentially removed what were considered to be problematic storylines from their films so that they could be shown in Nazi Germany. Again, not so uncommon even today. We have Google and Yahoo and others trying to figure out how to work with Chinese censors with regard to internet access. Anyway, this was happening in Germany as well. So it took a non-Jew working outside of a major studio system, but who had the power to make his own films, to make what really was America's first true film that called out the Jewish oppression under the Nazis, and that was Charlie Chaplin with The Great Dictator. Chaplin, of course, raised the money himself. He was, more powerful than Oprah. He was able to single-handedly make this film possible. He wrote it, he directed it, he starred in it, he wrote the score with Meredith Willson, oddly enough, from the Music Man fame. He created this critique of fascism in the form of a really wicked satire. It's a parody of authoritarian rule. The story is, briefly, a Jewish barber turns out to be an absolute lookalike for the dictator of the regime called Tomania. The dictator's name is Adenoid Hinkle. And in a series of events, they end up switching places. So I'm going to show you what's probably the most famous scene from The Great Dictator, in which the dictator, who's called the Fooey, not the Führer, the Fooey, appears, that's Chaplin, appears with his Goebbels-like character, his advisor, who in this film is named Garbage, played by Henry Daniell. And it's really one of the first spoofs of any kind on the screen of Adolf Hitler. The Three Stooges memorably made their own, not long afterwards. So as you watch this, put yourself back to the time, 1940. The U.S. is not yet involved in the war. Many nations are still collaborating with Germany, and this is what you would go to the movies to see Charlie Chaplin perform.
Leaders, they're all brunettes, not a blonde amongst them.
Brunettes are troublemakers, they're worse than the Jews.
Then wipe them out.
Too small, not so fast. We get rid of the Jews first, then concentrate on the brunettes.
She'll never have peace until we have a pure Aryan race. How wonderful. Tomania, a nation of blue-eyed blondes.
Why not a blonde Europe, a blonde Asia, a blonde America?
A blonde world.
And a brunette dictator.
Dictator of the world.
Why not? Out Caesar, out nullus. The world is effete, worn out, afraid. No nation would dare to oppose you.
Dictator of the world.
It's your destiny. We'll kill off the Jews, wipe out the brunettes. Then will come forth our dream, a pure Aryan race.
Beautiful blonde Aryans.
They will love you, they will adore you. They will worship you as a god.
No, you mustn't say it. You make me afraid of myself.
Yes, dictator of the world. We'll start with the invasion of Austerlitz. After that, we won't have to fight, we can bluff. Nation after nation will capitulate. Within 2 years, the world will be under your thumb.
Leave me. I want to be alone. Out Caesar, out Nolus, Emperor of the world. My word.
I think it's an amazing scene. It's sublime and funny and terrifying at the same time. Chaplin stated later that had he known the gravity and the depravity of the violence that was happening in the concentration camps, he would not have made the film at all, as a parody, interestingly. This became Chaplin's most successful film commercially of all time. And what's ironic is that, maybe unbeknownst to Chaplin at this time, Hitler was a huge fan of Charlie Chaplin, showed his film surreptitiously in Berlin, and Germany was actually pretty wild for Chaplin in his silent film days. And I just came back from Berlin a couple of weeks ago, and I went to the amazing film museum in Potsdamer Platz in Berlin. And there's an interesting little video that I watched, and it shows a thronging mass of people, absolutely almost overwhelming Chaplin on his first ever visit to Berlin in 1931. That's how crazy they were. It was a huge, swarming mass of people. And weirdly, ironically, that clip of thronging, swarming masses was taken out of context and used in the fake, scurrilous, mock fake documentary produced by the Nazi propaganda department called The Eternal Jew, to show the swarms of humanity that would occur if Jews were allowed to breed like rats and spread across Europe. And it's really interesting that it happens to be essentially B-roll taken of crowds thronging Chaplin on his visit to Berlin, and by the time this film came out, the official propaganda department in Berlin was denouncing Chaplin as a Jew. He was not a Jew. The success of The Great Dictator as a parody of totalitarianism and of Hitler may well have encouraged the creation of MGM's Ernst Lubitsch, a famous Jewish emigre director from Germany, to make another farce called To Be or Not to Be. And we saw a brief clip from the remake of that that Mel Brooks did much later. Coming off of Lubitsch's successes, making Ninotchka, working with Greta Garbo, and his lovely sort of very lovely Mitteleuropäisch romantic film, The Shop Around the Corner, he decided to pen what is essentially a kind of dark vaudeville farce called To Be or Not to Be, set in Warsaw, Poland, which at the point that he was making the film in 1940 Poland had already been invaded by the Germans. And even so, the setting for this film, which shows a theatrical troupe headed by Joseph Tura, the great Shakespearean actor of Warsaw, and they become involved in a kind of caper to try to thwart a nefarious set of activities that are being headed when Hitler visits Warsaw. And Lubitsch subversively cast Jack Benny, otherwise known as Benny Kubelski, if those of you who didn't know the name he was born with. He was born Jewish. He kind of subversively cast Benny as the great non-Jewish actor Joseph Tura, who is married to the leading lady, played by Carol Lombard. And this was Jack Benny's only starring film role. So let's take a look at one of the early clips from Ernst Lubitsch's To Be or Not to Be.
Der Führer! Heil Hitler! Heil Hitler!
Heil myself.
That's not in the script.
But Mr. Dobosh, please.
That's not in the script, Mr. Brunsky.
But it'll get a laugh.
But I don't want to laugh here. How many times have I told you not to add any line?
You want my opinion, Mr. Dobosh?
No, Mr. Greenberg, I do not want your opinion.
All right, let me give you my reaction. A laugh is nothing to be sneezed at.
Mr. Greenberg, I hired you as an actor, not as a writer, understand? No. What does the script say?
I make an entrance.
And what do you say?
Nothing.
Then say nothing.
But look,
Let's get going with this rehearsal. I have to play Hamlet tonight.
Here am I sitting waiting for my scene, all eager to go, and I have to wait and wait to be driven out of my mood just because too little actors in the cast want to enlarge their parts.
Mr. Ravitch, what you are, I wouldn't eat.
How dare you call me a ham?
Folks, I want everybody to understand this. This is a serious play, a realistic drama.
Good morning, Dobosh.
Good morning.
How do you like my dress?
Very good, very good. It is a document of Nazi Germany. Is that what you're going to wear in the concentration camp?
Well, don't you think it's pretty?
That's just it.
Well, why not? I think it's a tremendous contrast. Think of me being flogged in the darkness. I scream, suddenly the lights go on, and the audience discovers me on the floor in this gorgeous dress.
That's a terrific laugh.
That's right, Greenberg. You keep out of this. That a great star, an artist, could be so inartistic. You must be out of your mind.
What do you mean by talking to my wife like that? How dare you?
Well, I'm sorry. I lost my temper.
Sweetheart, the dress stinks.
You're only afraid I'm running away with the scene.
I afraid? Why should I be?
No, of course not. You're the greatest actor in the world. Everybody knows that, including you.
Don't be a prima donna.
Whenever there's a chance to take the spotlight away from me, it's becoming ridiculous the way you grab attention. Whenever I start to tell a story, you finish it. If I go on a diet, you lose the weight. If I have a cold, you cough. And if we should ever have a baby, I'm not so sure I'd be the mother.
I'm satisfied to be the father.
That last line is him saying, I'd be satisfied to be the father. So, To Be or Not to Be was the victim of bad timing. By the time it came out in 1942, I think May of 1942, 2 months earlier, Carol Lombard had tragically died in a plane crash. And, of course, the U.S. had already been invaded or bombed at Pearl Harbor. And so the public was not in a mood to receive and take in well this kind of fizzy, light comedy. Even now, seeing her joke about, wouldn't I look great in this dress in the concentration camp, we look at that and say, oh, that's like really distasteful. And of course, it's meant to be somewhat distasteful, but not to the degree that we think of now, because at that moment, nobody had seen images of what Jews or any other prisoners were actually looking like in concentration camps. So the film bombed. It was completely lost. Nobody wanted to look at it, which is one of the reasons why Mel Brooks did make his remake in 1983, which bombed for different reasons. I actually think the best scene in the film is the one that you've already seen, which is them singing Sweet Georgia Brown. It's kind of cute, but it doesn't just have the bite anymore because he'd already made the producers, and we already knew what it looked like to have a kind of anti-Nazi parody in a post-war American Jewish vein. So that really didn't work either. So the fact is that once the war broke out, American movies were, of course, made about the experiences of being in the war, but it was with a completely different set of intentions. A lot of Jewish filmmakers joined the Hollywood effort to become part of the U.S. Office of, I'm blanking now on the actual name, basically the war propaganda machine. Films were made about American experiences overseas, but they were mainly there to prop up the heroic effort of trying to fight totalitarianism in Europe. And these stories were not focused on the foreign oppressed victims, whether Jews, gypsies, homosexuals. This was not really the focus. The films made during the war focused on the fact that totalitarianism, as represented by Nazi Germany, was anti-American in its values that derided freedom and democracy. And that's what got people excited, as were the stories that people told in film. Now, within months of the armistice being signed in April of 1945, American audiences, viewers, began seeing newsreel footage of the horrific images coming out from the liberation of the concentration camps. American GIs began to filter back into the U.S., and the documentation films that were screened at the Nuremberg trials became seared in the American consciousness, the world consciousness of what the depravity of the Holocaust actually looked like. And this it still does influence the way we see the images associated with all stories of Nazi Germany and its oppression of Jews to this day. But despite the proliferation of images, we still have this absence of stories coming out of Hollywood about the experiences of Jews under German oppression in Europe for 20 years after the conclusion of the war. Why? Again, some ideas as to why there was this absence. A thought that filmmaking, particularly Hollywood filmmaking, narrative films, were insufficient to the task of expressing the enormity of the crime. A simple fact of these films can never go there, they can never really fully tell these stories, and so we're just not going to make them. There was certainly that sense, and particularly there were filmmakers in the post-war era very interested in the stories of political and social issues of the time, but who were somehow more comfortable turning their attention to new issues that were facing Americans: nuclear anxiety, the atom bomb, the Red Scare, urban poverty, crime, later civil rights issues. These all took the attention of American filmmakers, and many of them did not address the issues that had cropped up during the war. There was also, I think, perhaps some sense that the stories of oppression under Nazi Germany was just inappropriate to the medium. People knew how searing the documentary images were, but documentaries did not generally inform the style or substance of what American movie makers were actually looking at. And this is partly also when they did go to tell stories about experiences during the war, the stories were often watered down. The Jewish oppression was kind of generalized into a general oppression of anybody who had suffered under the Nazis. And it's also partly a matter of changing tastes. The fact is that under the production code, which went into effect in Hollywood in the 30s, you couldn't actually show what were considered to be distasteful or depraved images. And so the filmmakers were stripped in the US, it's a loaded word, I guess, of their ability to actually show the appropriate imagery that would convey their stories. So they were kind of making films with one hand tied behind their back, and many of them chose not to do it. And then the basic idea also is that films about oppression were really hard to sell, really hard to promote. There always had to be some kind of story of heroism or love or something much more palatable to the American taste. And nobody really wanted to focus on the stories of the oppressed people. It's as simple as that. And so we have this dearth of films, but there were some. 1948 saw the creation of a film called The Search, starring Montgomery Clift, in which he plays a US GI who is overseas, helping to take children who've been left in kind of displaced persons camps and to find their families. Now, the Jewish nature of many of these refugees was downplayed, but The Search was one of the first films, and this was, I think, 1948, to actively name the fact that there were hundreds of thousands of displaced Jews who had suffered, and through the work of this American GI were trying to find and make new lives. That same year, in the US, appeared a fantastic novel by Irwin Shaw called The Young Lions. The Young Lions told the stories of a very disparate group of American GIs, their experience training to going through boot camp, being sent overseas, and witnessing the horrors of the concentration camps and liberating them. And it was a very, very successful novel, and one of the key storylines is of a Jewish GI named Noah Ackerman. And he's an orphaned guy who, before he even goes to boot camp, he falls in love with a girl from Vermont named Hope, who's from this long-standing New England family. And the novel and the film that was made of it goes to great lengths to show that, especially in America, people from such disparate backgrounds could find a way to make common cause, and that this was going to be so different from the experiences that he as a Jew was going to witness when he got to Europe and to fight the totalitarian enemy. And his experience of racial fascism was going to be quite different from his experience at home. So the film wasn't made. It took a long time to make the film. Came out only 10 years later, in 1958. So I'm going to show you two scenes, both of them a little bit on the lengthy side, but they're really worthwhile. It's a great film. Here's Hope Lang as the character named Hope. Hope Plowman. Interesting that Irwin Shaw, the author, named the sort of WASP New England family Plowman. He named the Jewish GI Ackerman. Basically means the same thing. They both have their roots in the land, but of course the Jewish guy is urban, he's an orphan, and his connection to the land has been uprooted over generations. So here's Hope Lang and Montgomery Clift. He's going to visit her in New England and has to encounter her father, who does not know yet about his background.
He's Jewish, Father. Father, this is Noah.
How do you do?
How do you do, sir?
Well, seems to me that Mr. Ackerman and I might have a little talk.
Certainly, sir.
Why don't you finish your coffee, Hope? We won't be very long. That's Jack Marshall's. I went to school with his father. My father with his father. Virgil Smith's law office. One of his people did the legal work when they incorporated this town. 1750.
Well, looks like it's going to be a nice day.
It's a family plot. 7 generations of plowmen there. Hope's mother, too. There's a school.
Mr. Plowman, I don't have a family plot. I don't have a family. I earn $35 a week, and I won A in the draft. But I love Hope, and I shall love her for all my life.
You're doing an awful thing. Putting a man to the test of his principles. I wish to heaven you'd turn around, get on that bus, and never see Hope again. But you won't do that. Will you? Didn't think you would. Anybody from town to ask to marry Hope, I'd say, come on out the house. We got turkey for dinner. I never knew a Jew before. You go along all your life, thinking a certain way. Someone jolts you, you have to look inside yourself. That's what you made me do, and I'm not fond of you for it. Just tell Mr. Ackerman we've got turkey for dinner.
So that's Vaughn Taylor as the father. I forgot to credit him. Noah goes off to get his GI training, where he suffers tremendous, really kind of brutal treatment at the hand of others for his difference. It's never named that it's anti-Semitic bullying. It's really clear that it's bullying. They call him out for his New York ways. But he is sent overseas and ends up becoming one of the liberators of a concentration camp. When this film came out in 1958, 10 years had passed since the creation of the book, and the U.S. at this point was in a very different place with regard to its relations with Germany. Germany was now. So I should say that. What I didn't mention is that another key storyline of the novel is it's following this group of American GIs, but there's a German character as well who also is a soldier by the name of Christian Diestel. And the project of Irwin Shaw, the author, was to show Christian Diestel, who becomes an officer in the German army, to show the gradual corruption of an otherwise upstanding German, to try to understand how do people become the agents of evil. And it was one of the first full-fledged portraits of a German officer in American fiction. By the time this movie is made, 10 years later, the U.S. is heavily dependent on its alliance with Germany against a new enemy, which is the Soviet Union. And a lot of folks were in the studios were quite concerned about what it would mean to show a picture of an everyday German who becomes a monster. And so the author, Irwin Shaw, was not involved in the creation of the screenplay. And the filmmaker, Edward Dmytryk, who actually had been one of the Hollywood 10, he was blacklisted for his connections to communism, later actually did end up naming names, which is why he was able to work openly on this film. he cast, in a way controversially, he cast Marlon Brando as the German officer, Christian Diestel. And Brando famously dyed his hair platinum blonde and began to work with the screenwriter to portray Christian Diestel, again with that very ironically named first name, as a moral German who was in a way the victim of the ideology that was happening around him. He was not an agent of it, but rather a victim of it. In fact, there's Irwin Shaw, when he got wind of this, the author was infuriated, and he apparently paid a visit to the set, and the anecdote goes that he took Brando aside to tell him that it was important to play this character as somebody who's not just a victim of the ideology around him, and Brando snapped back at him, "You don't know what the hell you're talking about. You don't know who this character is," to the author of the book. But despite this, the film came out, and we're going to see one of the last scenes here in which the character of that Marlon Brando plays, who is now essentially on the run from the invading Americans, happens upon a concentration camp. And it is one of the first film depictions of a concentration camp in which we actually see the victims. It's still rather muted by our contemporary standards, but it's in a way it's an important scene, and we also understand that the liberating American troops are being commanded by a Jewish captain.
Yes?
I was wondering if you had some food, sir.
We have no food. We've already been cleaned out by deserters.
I'm not a deserter. My company has defected, I am without command, and I have not eaten anything in 2 days.
Forgive me, Captain. Sit down, pour yourself some coffee. It's a relief to find someone who still has some sense of discipline left. How close are the Americans?
Well, I think they are, I don't know, 5 minutes or 5 hours.
I'm sorry. That's all that's left.
Thank you.
Everything is gone. Colonels and generals passing by, snatching the food out of my hands, throwing away their uniforms. Unbelievable. My men are running too. This organization is falling apart in front of my eyes. I'm sorry. Are you hurt?
No.
I can see you had a bad time. Well, so did I. I have my wounds too, even if you don't see them.
Running a concentration camp is not a picnic, believe me. With all the gas chambers, target ranges, doctors with their experiments. I had an extermination quota of 1,500 people a day. Jews, Poles, Russians, Frenchmen, political prisoners. And I had only 260 men to do it. Still, I managed it. Then they sent memorandums from Berlin. Inspectors running, shouting. In Auschwitz, they killed 20,000 a day. I know who it is. It's Berlin again. For the 4th time today. Yes. Yes. Very near, a few miles. I told you. All right, I didn't tell you. I told whoever it was that called. I have 10 men left. How can I kill everybody in the camp? Don't you understand? The equipment is not working. Nothing is working. I don't care what they did in Buchenwald. I am here alone and I have no personnel left. You know what this is, this phone call? They want me to kill every man, woman, and child in the camp before the Americans get here. 6,000 people. And the man who asked me to do this same man will walk the streets free. And they will come to him, the Americans, the Russians, and he will say, I never heard of concentration camps. He will say there never was a national policy to kill 12 million people. The SS invented it. Nobody in the government ever heard of it. And I'll be here trying to explain to the Americans. You know, The Americans may not understand what they see here. They may not know that a German officer, our kind of officer, does what he is ordered to do. Well, we at least know what is important. The courage to stay and face the enemy, and the honor to be able to say, I have done my duty for the fatherland. What's the matter?
So that's pretty much the most shocking image that American films had, feature films had put on view. Again, recalling a lot of the documentary images that Jews and Americans worldwide, Americans and Jews worldwide would have been familiar with from the liberation images. And the film concludes with the Jewish captain of the liberating army ordering that a religious service should be held at the liberated concentration camp. And the film positions the American Jew as the kind of moral authority figure in a way, and very much asks this question of what does it take to be a moral person, where you've seen the failing of the Christian Diestel character and the success of the flawed American way of life. That's part of the project of this film. As I say, it is really one of the few that dealt this graphically, and even this, the suffering was really not depicted beyond this very scene. But it was an advance, certainly. There is still a lot of skittishness in U.S. tastes for telling these stories, and so it's very interesting to see with the Diary of Anne Frank, which came out the very next year. This was, of course, a story that had rocketed to the headlines. People were reading Anne Frank's diary in schools. It was being taught. People understood that here was a teenage girl who could be, who was sort of a, who you could connect with in a very human way. And when Hollywood came to make the film based on the play of her life story as told in the diary as edited by her father, it was interesting to see how it was going to be promoted with all of those caveats that the studios had and trepidations about would people come to see what they knew was a very dark picture, or at least a dark subject matter. So from the beginning, there was a sense that her Jewishness and the oppression of the story needed to be soft-pedaled. They cast lovely Millie Perkins, about the most non-Jewish, bob-nosed actress you could find, put her in a dark wig, and she's Anne Frank. They de-Semitized a lot of the family relations, and many of the most famous passages that Anne Frank had written about in her own diary that referred to the plight of Jews, the script turned into the problem, the references became to the suffering of people, not Jews. So I want to show you actually the trailer that was released to promote the film. And it's very interesting to see what aspects of the story were being emphasized.
The way that you must live until it is over if you are to survive.
I know almost for certain that Margaret would never kiss anyone unless she was engaged to them. And I'm sure, too, that Mother never touched a man before Father. But I don't know. Things are so different now. Mr. Russell.
Something for me? Capsules.
They're earplugs.
They went in. They went in.
Rejoicing and merrily voicing the Hanukkah song that we sing.
Fascinating how you do get a snippet of the Hanukkah song, but you don't hear the word Hanukkah mentioned. So as I mentioned, it really would be 20 years after the end of the war until we finally get a realistic depiction of the impact of the war on Jews. In this particular case, Sidney Lumet's amazing The Pawnbroker, which is a psychological portrait of a survivor who has survived the camps and has moved to New York and is living a very minimal existence as a pawnbroker, locking himself in a kind of steel cage in Spanish Harlem. And the film is remarkable for a number of reasons, particularly the performance of Rod Steiger as the pawnbroker Saul Nazarman, this embittered, broken man. And it's a tremendous portrait, an amazing score by Quincy Jones. It's interesting because they allow you to understand that he's haunted by something which clearly is of his experience during the war, but you don't really get that spelled out until in a very gradual way. You see momentary, sometimes 3 or 4 frame flashback images. It's one of the most, at that time, inventive uses of flashback, not as full sequences, but rather in the way that you just have a flash of memory. And they gradually become longer and more explicit memories as the film goes on. I want to again show you two clips, I think they're pretty much back to back, showing you this film's depiction of two different kinds of survivors. The first, you'll see a scene with Rod Steiger as Saul Nazarman in his pawn shop, talking to his kind of mentee and a young Latin fellow who kind of idolizes him.
Teaching time, Mr. Nasserman. Time to teach. Now, last time you taught me gold, right? What are you going to teach me tonight?
Tonight I teach you to save your penny.
I'm going to do that, Mr. Nasserman. Yes, sir. Now, in the meantime, I'm learning business from my master, right? So I got to know one thing. Something I've been thinking about. So how come you people come to business so natural?
You people? Oh, I see. Yeah. I see. You want to learn the secret of our success, is that right? All right. I teach you. First of all, you start off with a period of several thousand years, during which you have nothing to sustain you but a great bearded legend. Oh, my friend, you have no land to call your own, to grow food on, or to hunt. You have nothing. You're never in one place long enough to have a geography, or an army, or a land myth. All you have is a little brain and a great bearded legend to sustain you and convince you that you are special, even in poverty. But this little brain, that's the real key, you see. With this little brain, you go out and you buy a piece of cloth and you cut that cloth in two and you go out and sell it for a penny more than you paid for it. Then you run right out and buy another piece of cloth, cut it into 3 pieces and sell it for 3 pennies profit. But my friend, during that time, you must never succumb to buying an extra piece of bread for the table or a toy for a child. No, you must immediately run out and get yourself a still larger piece of cloth, and so you repeat this process over and over, and suddenly you discover something. You have no longer any desire, any temptation to dig into the earth to grow food or to gaze at a limitless land and call it your own. No, no. You just go on and on and on, repeating this process over the centuries, over and over, and suddenly you make a grand discovery. You have a mercantile heritage. You are a merchant. You're known as a usurer, a man with secret resources, a witch, a pawnbroker, a sheenie, a monkey, and a kite.
You're really some teacher, Mr. Nasman. You really is the greatest.
And not long after this scene, we see Saul Nazarman in a scene with another survivor who has come out of his experiences with more life inside him, even though he's on his deathbed. And here's the survivor named Mendel that the Nazarman character is helping take care of.
Guilt. And there it is, guilt, to find yourself alive. And so you wrap yourself in a kind of a shroud and feel you share the dignity of death with those who really died. Tell me, does blood ever flow through you, Saul Nazarman? Can you feel pain?
No.
You are a fake. You breathe, you eat, you walk, you make money. You take a dream and give $1 and give no hope. I survive. Survive. A coward survival, and at what a price. No love, no passion, no pity. Dead. Shown as a man, the walking dead.
And that's Baruch Lumet, Sidney Lumet's father, playing the role of Mendel. This film really was one of the first deeply felt psychological portraits of survival. It also, in the flashback scenes, was unsparing in its willingness, its bravery, basically, to show nudity, not for any sexual titillation, but because of the degradation of women. So you had women with bare chests, totally flouting the production code, and this was basically became the film that broke the production code. The folks who supervised what was called the Hays Code decided not to protest the film, basically said, you know, what are they going to do? Say that you shouldn't be showing nudity when you're showing the depravity of the way people were treated in the camps, and so it kind of opened the floodgates. There really wasn't further enforcement of the production code after 1965, and it was officially abandoned. But this theme of the impact of the war on survivors became one of the ways that films began to delve into the experiences of the war without actually having to show the war. And one of the great contributions in survivor tales, I think, in the movies, is the 1989 film Enemies, A Love Story, which is an adaptation of an Isaac Bashevis Singer story. His first set in the United States. Of course, he wrote it was a Yiddish language novel, but his first set in the United States. He wrote it in 1966, and it is in part the story of a character whom you'll see here played by Ron Silver, who survives the war, moves to the United States, moves on with his life after he believes that his wife is killed, and she comes back kind of almost as a ghost. I mean, she's alive, but so the scene you're going to see here is their first meeting. He's answered an ad saying that they're looking for his whereabouts, but he doesn't really know why he's being summoned to the Lower East Side. So here is Ron Silver and Angelica Houston.
Come in, Mr. Broder.
A miracle from heaven, brother. A miracle. Call her in. Wife has already died.
No, Emma. Didn't know that you were alive.
It's something you never knew.
Our children?
Dead.
Sit down. They told me that you were killed by a
They shot
firing
2 bullets
squad.
into me. One is still here in my body.
It's as if you've risen from the dead.
We were dumped in an open pit. Hundreds of us. We thought we were all dead. But I crawled over some corpses and escaped at night. It was raining when the Nazis would have seen me. Then I fled to Russia. I lived in the woods for years. How is it my uncle didn't know where you were? We had to put an advertisement in the paper.
I don't have my own apartment. I live with someone else.
What do you do? Where do you live?
I didn't know that you were alive.
Who's the lucky woman who has taken my place, Herman?
She isn't Jewish. Yeah. She's the daughter of the Pole in whose house I lived in during the war.
Who is she?
She was our servant. You know her, right? Jadwiga.
Jadwiga? You married her? Forgive me. Wasn't she a little simple-minded? I remember she didn't know how to put on a pair of shoes. Your brother used to tell me how she used to put the left shoe on the right foot.
Tamara. She saved my life.
Was there no better way to repay her? Sorry. Shouldn't ask. Do you have any children by her?
Children?
Well, it wouldn't shock me if you did. I assumed you crawled into bed with her even when you were with me.
That's nonsense. I never crawled into bed with her.
Oh, really?
No.
Well, we never really did have a marriage. All we ever did was argue.
So what was I supposed to do? 1 minute you were drugs.
You never had any respect for me, for my ideas.
That's not true. You know that.
Why don't you have any children by her? Why are you looking at me like that? You married her.
No, why? Because for 1 minute I said, well, maybe you have changed. But I say, you haven't changed. You're still the same.
No.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
No,
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
not the
Yeah.
same. No, I'm not the same. I'm dead. They put nylon stockings on me. They dyed my hair. They polished my fingernails. God help me. But I'm dead. So I bear no grudges against anyone. Nor am I dependent on anyone.
No, but
I just hope you're not playing the same tricks on
I
your
am
new
not-
wife that you played on me.
Another amazing scene, and whereas the Saul Nazarman character we saw from the Pawnbroker is the Walking Dead who can't escape his memories. Here we have, in a similar vein, the Angelica Houston character, all the characters really who are survivors being to some degree at loose ends, at moral loose ends, not knowing how to fill out the shells of their lives after their experiences, morally and spiritually. But as I mentioned, despite some of these survivor stories, Hollywood really didn't try to depict the actual experiences of Jews in the camps for a variety of reasons. And there are 35 years that separate The Young Lions, where we saw that liberation scene in the camps, 35 years that separate that film from Schindler's List. Not that there weren't films in the intervening years that told stories of actual experiences in the camps. You think of, actually the television series, 1978, I think Holocaust was a landmark, was often seen as trivializing, but it was still a kind of a landmark series that dared to tell the stories of Jews going into the camps. You had something like Sophie's Choice. Interestingly, both of those projects starred Meryl Streep, not Jewish, in key roles. But for the most part, if Hollywood was going to tell stories about the wartime years, it was going to be more in the vein of a kind of Nazi hunting thrillers like The Odessa File or Boys from Brazil, or liberation stories like The Dirty Dozen or wartime heroism stories. And for the a variety of reasons, including the fact that the great American filmmaking renaissance of the 1970s really was more preoccupied with Vietnam, with civil rights, with urban poverty at home, and really wasn't turning the clock back much to look at the World War II stories to ring true for this much more morally ambiguous age that we were living in. But then you have 1993's Schindler's List, made by Steven Spielberg. In some ways, a towering achievement of realism in film, and also has its own critics for the way it packages the story of Oskar Schindler, again, the non-Jewish hero of the film. I want to show you a film, an extended clip from here, because I think it's a completely masterful filmmaking sequence. Knowing the history that we've seen of sometimes of the trivialization of the Jewish stories, Spielberg himself set out to educate himself visually with the images of wartime Europe. And so he looked at the documentaries that had come out from the Nuremberg trials. He looked at Alain René's Night and Fog. He looked at the films that were shown during the Nuremberg trials, and he steeped himself. He looked at Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, a 9-hour amazing documentary, really almost entirely made of interviews, to try to get himself into a frame of mind where he could make this very, very difficult film based on the novel by Thomas Keneally. And so he chose to shoot the film in black and white, and he wanted to create as realistic and visceral an experience of the reality of life under totalitarian, oppressive occupation as he could. The scene I'm going to show you is the scene of the liquidation of the Krakow ghetto. It's tough to watch, but you are here at this topic, so that maybe goes without saying. He decided to shoot primarily on location. 40% of the entire film is shot handheld. He wants to take you into this experience. And this has all the strengths and some of the drawbacks of what have become known as kind of the tropes, not just of Spielberg's films, but of Holocaust storytelling. But let's just watch, and if it's possible to sort of marvel at the filmmaking as well as get pulled into the story, it's really worth seeing. I think it's about a 7-minute sequence.
Man to the right, women to the left, women to the left, man to the right. Women to the left, man to the right.
Mila!
You have a blow sign.
Now it doesn't matter anymore. They are cleaning out the ghetto.
There is not enough room for you.
What are you talking about? We tried it before. There's more than enough room.
I changed my mind. Oh, look at the space in there. Now look at me. You are just scared. I can fit the girl, but not you.
Mama, I'm coming out.
Stay where you are. I'd rather you be here than who knows where.
Commandant!
Very good, salute.
I respectfully report I've been given orders to clear the bundles from the road, so there will be no obstructions to the thoroughfare.
Thomas, enjoying the lines, little Polish clicking soldier.
Mrs. Dresner?
Yes. Oh, you are a friend of my son's. Don't worry, I'll go quietly. I'll be no trouble.
No, get under the stairs. They'll be down searching soon. You'll be safe there. Please, hide.
Right by the sun.
Please, hide under the stairs. I've searched the building. There's no one here. Hello, Adam. Hello, Danka. Come with me. I will put you in the good line.
Do you know the saying now of life is still life? You are not a boy anymore. I'm saying a blessing for you. Let's go, please. Come on.
So this one sequence, you see so many interwoven individual stories. He's really, Spielberg is really quite masterful at not allowing you to lose track of the individual emotional moments taking place on this huge, huge canvas. And the film was greeted very much as a masterpiece. Of course, along with its strengths of camera work and sobriety, it also was subject to many critiques. Some people don't like that he's tends to be emotionally manipulative. There's this, of course, the sense that you are looking at this moral transformation of a non-Jewish character on the outside, literally high up on the hill watching this happening, and that the glimmer of hope that the film raises in terms of Oskar Schindler's later heroic acts in saving Jews is far too important emotionally vis-a-vis the suffering or the tragedies that afflicted 6 million Jews. Seeing the stories filtered through the images of children, children's choir, these are tropes that Spielberg relied on and also would become tropes of Hollywood and other people's storytelling about the Holocaust. You think about films like Jacob the Liar or Life is Beautiful, which is an Italian film, which found ways of telling the grim stories of suffering under Nazism through the experiences of children, for better, for worse. And films, even like Schindler's List, were accused by many, including many Jewish critics, as the continuing desensitization of American and other audience members to the actual stories, that nothing, even a well-made, solemn film like Schindler's List, could hold a candle to the reality of suffering. And some people, including critics like Elie Wiesel, have said there's really no way to tell fictional stories of the Holocaust. And that remains a conundrum for film storytellers. How do you honor those experiences if you're not going to tell them in the form of stories? And yet once you start building sets or creating soundtracks or casting stars in these stories, it begins to resemble something that many people find to be problematic in telling the stories of suffering. Nonetheless, Schindler's List went on to win, as you know, many multiple Oscars, and ushered in a bit of a looser age in terms of American storytelling that was willing to look at this period. And the last clip I want to show you is, in a way, I don't know if it's the what's the right word, ne plus ultra, or the nadir. It's some end of the spectrum of Hollywood storytelling about Jewish stories during the Holocaust, and that is Quentin Tarantino's Inglorious Bastards, which, if this is the most solemn kind of reverential depiction of trying to attempt to get at something about the reality of Jewish suffering under Nazism, Inglorious Bastards is an utter revenge fantasy. It is, and as I said, this clip, the film is extremely violent. I'm not going to show you literally a violent clip, but its tone is obviously quite veering toward physical violence and foreboding. This is Brad Pitt playing a kind of renegade squad leader in the forests. He's out with a band of people, including American Jews, out hunting for Nazis in the middle of the war. As I say, revenge fantasy. And you'll see Eli Roth at the end of the clip.
Can I assume you know who we are?
You're Elder the Apache.
But weren't you heard of us, you probably heard we ain't in the prisoner-taking business. We in the killing Nazi business. And cousin, business is booming.
Oh, yeah.
That leaves two ways we can play this out. Either kill you or let you go. Whether or not you're gonna leave this ditch alive depends entirely on you. Up the road a piece, there's an orchard. Besides you, we know there's another crop patrol fucking around there somewhere. If that patrol were to have any crack shots, that orchard would be a goddamn sniper's delight. So if you ever wanna eat a sauerkraut sandwich again, you gotta show me on this here map where they are. You gotta tell me how many they are, and you gotta tell me what kind of artillery they're carrying with them.
You can't expect me to divulge information that would put German lives in danger.
Well, now, Warner, that's where you're wrong, because that's exactly what I expect. I need to know about Germans hiding in trees, and you need to tell me. And you need to tell me right now. Now, just take that finger of yours and point out on this here map where this party's being held. How many's coming, and what they brought to play with.
I respectfully refuse, sir.
Hear that?
Yes.
It's Sergeant Donnie Donowitz. You might know him better by his nickname, the Bear Jew. Now, have you heard Aldo the Apache? You got heard about the Bear Jew.
I heard of the Bear Jew.
What'd you hear?
Beats German soldiers with a club.
He bashes their brains in with a baseball bat, what he does. And Werner, I'm gonna ask you one last goddamn time. If you still respectfully refuse, I'm calling the Bear Jew over. He's gonna take that big bat of his, and he's gonna beat your ass to death with it. Now take your wiener schnitzel licking finger and point out on this map what I wanna know.
Fuck you. And your Jew dogs!
Actually, we're all tickled to hear you say that. Quite frankly, watching Donnie beat Nazis to death is the closest we ever get to going to the movies. Donnie!
Yeah?
Guy's German here wants to die for country. Oblige him. Jews?
Bravery.
So we go from a character like Montgomery Clift played, Noah Ackerman, the soft-spoken Jew who goes to the war and becomes a kind of figure of moral authority, and Christian Diestel, the Marlon Brando figure, who is unbeknownst to his sense of Germanness being infected by the Nazi ideology. We've come now all the way to this kind of revenge fantasy where Jews with Louisville sluggers are prowling the forests of Germany and Poland, executing with great sense of moral justice themselves, their own kind of revenge. So I don't know if that's 180 degrees or something. We've gone from pre-Hollywood's, pre-war Hollywood's utter avoidance of this topic to a kind of fantastical celebration of what it means to overcome persecution, for better, for worse. Now, what's interesting is I think this entire trajectory, for me anyway, goes to the theme of what we've been talking about last session and what Ruth and I will continue on in the next couple sessions, which is that the movies get to be our nation's kind of projections, literally and figuratively, not only of a historical moment, but about our deepest yearnings and fears, and they can tell us something about how we are responding to the worlds around us, and hopefully this kind of 60 or 70 year march through the way that Hollywood has treated the Holocaust lets us understand who we were, how we understood ourselves, and also makes us wonder how images of our own generation's traumas will end up being depicted in films to come. Thank you. I'm not sure if there's questions, or what do you think, Barbara?
Yes. Well, first of all, please join me in thanking Peter for an extraordinary afternoon. It was moving and it was thoughtful, and I just can't thank you enough. It was just fantastic. So a couple of quick things here. As Peter mentioned, there are 2 more of these afternoons. The next one is on March 29th. That will be with Ruth Stein. And When Jews Meet Gentiles, a rich subject. And then the final with both Ruth and Peter is on April 26th. And I know it's hard after seeing all these clips and this material to sort of gather yourselves, but Peter is willing and available if anybody has questions or comments or reactions, or you're just stunned and you want to sit there for a minute. Yeah, okay, I'm going to come to you so everybody in the room can hear you. Why don't you come on out? Okay, thank you.
Oh, by the way, that class on April 26th is on Jewish humor in the movies.
Oh, yeah. So
and we'll talk a lot more about Mel Brooks in that one than just the one tap dancing clip.
I'm wondering, in the mid kind of 2006 to 2010 or 11, there were a lot of films, I thought, on the Holocaust. Was there something in the air? I mean, the boy in striped pajamas, I thought you had to identify with a very cute Christian boy to think at all about the Holocaust, it seemed, until the end of that movie. But what was in the air then? Did you think that kind of 5-year span, there was something?
That's interesting. I haven't thought about that span in particular, although it coincides with the years that I was running the Jewish Film Festival here, and it seemed like every year there was a plethora of films. Most of them we didn't get a chance to see in the U.S. because they were kind of run-of-the-mill stories. I'm not sure. It may have been. What's interesting is that you have a lot of filmmakers making films now, and maybe the 2000s were about the period when this generation came of age, who had no direct experience of the war themselves, at the most through their parents. And so more and more, the stories of the Holocaust became simply interesting period material to work with great drama, with great suffering, with heroism, with human beings in extremis. And it may have taken that long, basically 40 years, for a whole generation of filmmakers to come of age who basically looked with a kind of equanimity at that period and said, well, I could make a Civil War drama, or I could make a Holocaust drama. Now, I'm being flippant about it, but there may be something to that, because I saw a huge amount of dramas during that time. It seemed like every year there was something, not just American, but France, Germany in particular, some very strong dramas. The Netherlands, Italy, even we had a film, I think it was in the festival a couple of years ago, from China about the experiences of Shanghai Jews. It wasn't very good, but it was like they're even looking at their own Holocaust history.
Can you compare and contrast what some of the American filmmakers and the European filmmakers were doing related to this topic? You just started talking about that a second ago, but
right.
If you could expand on that.
That's a big question, and I'm not sure I can be too succinct about it because I haven't thought about it too much. I can definitely make one comparison, which is how German filmmakers have dealt with the Holocaust, which is a very special case, of course. German filmmakers have treated the subject with extremely, extremely delicate gloves. There was prohibition of showing Nazi imagery, for example, in German films after the war for a long, long time. You had to get special permission. For example, there was an amazing film made a couple of years ago called, oh shoot, I'm so sorry, it's by Danny Levy. Somebody help me here. It had the word Führer in it, something like My Führer, or Our Führer, in which he had to get special dispensation from the government of Berlin for the period pieces, for the period filmmaking, to actually hang Nazi banners on the streets of Germany. So they have, in a way, in Germany, been stunted to some degree in being able to tell the stories because there just hasn't been that sense of freedom of full access to emotions like nuance, nostalgia. It's changing now. So I can certainly make that comparison. There have been amazing films about the war experience from England, in particular, but I'm not sure that there's. I would say that the volume of material coming out of the U.S. is so much greater than the film production of most other countries that we just have a chance to see many more American expressions of it. But it's a good thought, and maybe I'll put my ideas together, and that'll be part of the next chapter.
Next one's
Yes.
over here, Peter.
As a Christian married to a Jew for 41 years, quite happily, I have to say that both of us have been disturbed that Hollywood often has Christian actors playing Jews, and you noted that in your talk, and yet we forced many Jewish actors to immediately, as a rite of passage, change their names, Christianize their names, and impersonate Christians their entire lives as actors. Why do you think America has done this?
I don't want to speak for America as to why. Of course, you know, I mean, the American entertainment business has a long, long history of asking every ethnicity to essentially sandpaper away what makes them different, and not just Jews. You know, and in the movie industry is maybe the most visible of them. You know, you have people, you know, John Gilbert or Tony Curtis. I mean, so many willingly wanted to change their names in order to have access to better roles. What's more interesting is now with films with recognizable Jewish characters, they're still not so easy to make. For example, American films, I'm not talking about television right now, but films where Jewish stories are very prominent are actually quite infrequent. Television is a little bit different. I mean, people talked about the series Transparent with Jeffrey Tambor as a transgender older man making a transition to becoming a woman as a very groundbreaking trans film or a queer narrative. I think it is the most transgressive and interesting Jewish television series in a long time because it's a very recognizable West LA assimilated dysfunctional Jewish family who doesn't try to hide it. One of the key characters is a woman rabbi, and it's like, oh, I recognize these people. But that's the exception to the rule. It's off point, perhaps, from what you've asked in terms of trying to kind of assimilate. But all I can say is I think that Hollywood has been among, despite or perhaps because of being so influenced by Jewish artists and run by Jewish producers, has been at the forefront, in a way, of trying to deracinate much of its film and casting.
Another question over here, Peter.
Do you think that the way Hollywood has dealt with the Holocaust is at all similar with the way Hollywood has dealt with the issue of American slavery?
I was hoping you were going to end your sentence with that word. Yes, I do. What's interesting is that with the slavery stories, this is such a deeply American issue that we have to kind of take responsibility for as a country and have had great trepidation in addressing that in films. The Nazi oppression of Jews could be seen at least as something that was happening overseas, not at our behest. So it's been a little easier for Hollywood to make stories that deal directly with that oppression. That said, much of Hollywood is interested in the bottom line, and it's very hard to make hard-hitting dramas about real social issues. And so I think that's one of the things that has kept many of those films from, or more films about the difficult subjects being made.
Next question's here, Peter.
I just like the way Jon Stewart addressed the whole question of how you deal with your own name. He was asked why he changed his name. He said, John Leibovitz, to Hollywood.
Thank you for that. That's great.
Once again, I want to thank all of you for being here today. Most of all, thank Peter Stein. Have a wonderful afternoon.